this. All right, everybody. So I want to show you something on your Canvas site here. Scroll down. We are now module 8. We are moving right along, everybody. This is, I believe, the official halfway point of this class and the semester. Hard to believe. We're going to be talking about Fukuyama this week and next. I see, and here are your responses for today and the responses for next week. Okay. What I wanted to show you all is that I have posted the next paper topics and directions to Canvas. And they are largely the same directions. I'm looking for 4 to 5 pages in length. They with standard formatting, they're due on November 4th. I will deduct a third of a grade for each day they're late. By the way, you have till the end of the day on the 4th. So whole day. What else should I tell you? I included a link here for the writing studio for those of you who I would recommend using it. Grading criteria, looks like I'm missing something. I meant to include clarity. I'll fix that. Same grading criteria as with your first papers. Footnoting, again, I'm asking you all to footnote in using Chicago style. I have a separate flyer handout explaining that just a second. And this is all in preparation of the final research papers where you'll be footnoting a variety of sources. So even if you only use one source for these papers, I still want you to footnote your sources in Chicago style. And please note that you don't give all the information for all your footnotes from the same text. You can abbreviate for subsequent footnotes. Okay, just the author name and page. Topics. I'll leave you these to look at. This time I am opening them. I'm opening these papers up to evaluation critical engagement from you. So there you go. You can look at those and let me know if you have any questions. Those are due in 2 weeks, module 10. And the other thing I've included for you here is a footnoting and style sheet, which I would like you to make use of from here on out or pay attention to. There's a couple of things I'll call your attention to. Those of you who have taken classes with me, you are familiar with this sheet that I like to give my students about some style tips. This grid is helpful because it tells you what kinds of things to footnote. You don't just footnote quotes. You must footnote statistics. Anytime numbers show up or data, anytime statistics or data show up in your paper, you must footnote them. Otherwise, I will think you are making them up. Okay. Part 2 explains how to footnote different types of sources. When you wish to footnote an article or a poem or a movie, this is where you can look to you consult this handout, tell you how to footnote. What is the proper formatting of footnotes for different sources, different types of sources? Okay. Part 3 is how to create a footnote in MS Word, but that can apply to Google Docs as well. I haven't noticed any widespread problems with footnoting, so I'm going to move past that one. But there is something I wanted to share with you all here to put on your radar. Some of you have had, who I've taught before, will know that I want you all to learn this. Listen, everybody, there's a special way to format large quotes, and this is it. Okay. I made up a little miniature essay about Machiavelli here for this purpose. This is a quote, and you'll see this. I'm trying to think if there are any passages in your reading for today, but the proper formatting of large quotes, and I see it in Fukuyama, actually page 102. Now, don't change the font size, okay? But you'll notice that a large quote, and by large quote, I define that as 4 lines or more. Okay. You need to do a couple things. You need to set it off apart. It looks like a little block in the middle of the paragraph, right? It is not indented. Most of them, crucially, notice there's no quotation marks. Okay. You give the quote, footnote as usual, return to your writing. Okay. you're at a stage in your academic careers now where you need to learn this and figure it out. Okay. So I will pay attention to how you do this going forward. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. Stylistic issue that I have mentioned on a couple of your papers were salient. Don't just drop a quote. Please introduce it, right? Uh, Fukuyama says, as Fukuyama argues. There is also usually sometimes some confusion about how to indicate book titles or whether you indicate them at all. It's not enough to just capitalize a book title. You have to italicize it or underline. Other things you like to underline or italicize: newspaper, magazine titles, movies. When you use quotation marks, articles from a newspaper, a magazine, a journal, internet, okay? And pay attention to whether a subject is plural or singular. I haven't seen this to be a big problem. For example, a company is a singular entity. Micah is an it, not a they. A family is an it, not a they. An association is an it, not a they. Okay. That's all I believe I wanted to say about that. Also, common mistake I'm going to put here in the chat. I can't recall how many or if any of you were making this mistake, but what is the difference between its and its?
It's with the apostrophe is a contraction.
You got it.
And then it's is every other type of it's.
Well, I need a little more specific about that. Why don't you tell us what is a contraction?
A contraction is a combination of two words to make it shorter.
Its is equals
It is. Yeah.
Okay, there it is. So then what's its?
It's is like when referring to a person or an object or anything else like that. Like so it's like or possessive.
That's the word I was looking for,
Yeah.
Zach. Thank you. It's the possessive. And the reason, of course, that this is so confusing is because, the possessive for usually Zach's car, I'll have an apostrophe in there. So people often think that its is the possessive, but it is not. It is a contraction. ITS is the possessive. Okay? So get that ironed out. But like I said, I can't remember too many offenders on this one. Anybody have any questions about the papers? Anybody? Not at this point? That's fine. All right. Good. Does anybody have any other issues or questions about anything? Everything going okay? Are people getting ready to vote, I hope? I mean, people in this country. Good. 2 weeks from now, gosh, the election is less than 2 weeks away. So 2 weeks from now, we will have a class meeting. I guess none of you guys were in college in 2016, right? You guys, 2016 was bad. The day after the election, it was really, really, really rough. I'm hoping not for a repeat, but I plan for us to have a discussion the day after the election this year, whichever way it goes. Okay. But yeah. There's no 2 weeks from today when we meet, you will not have a reading assignment. Your papers will be due. So we have an open discussion day. And I think I'm going to reserve it to talk about that stuff. Okay. Good. So let's dive into Fukuyama. So Fukuyama is, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll pause for a second. Biden going to win. God, I'm praying for you. Praying you're right. Um,
It's so statistically improbable right now. The only reason that any model has been predicting like at 12 and 100 is a function of the variability of the next 2 weeks. If you did the election right now and you still applied a 2016 polling error, he would not win.
God, I hope you're right. Well, there's also been a lot of votes already cast, more than at any other election so far. So,
Well, Republicans always win when it's low turnout. That's just how it is.
but it's looking like this might be a high turnout one. So do what you can. By the way, I have a student in another class who's working the polls. If you're able to, I really, really strongly recommend it. It will be needed. Or do what you can, you know. Either getting out the vote, helping with voter registration, although that's probably too late. Okay. You have a challenge from Mason. So Gabriel, if you have any articles supporting your point, then feel free to share them. I'm sure people might be interested.
I'll just point you to 538.com, and everybody who will criticize them for getting quote unquote the election wrong in 2016 do not understand statistics, do not understand probabilities, and it was completely within the range of probabilities. So just like I'll put the link in the chat here.
Well, yeah. So what Mason and Gabriel are referring to is that, 4 years ago, there was a lot of complaints about the polling errors. And there's been a lingering debate about this. It turns out that, I believe the election results were actually pretty much what the polls had predicted. Hillary still won the vote by a couple million people. The problem is always, as always, is the Electoral College in America. So, and Donald Trump won by a fraction of the vote in a couple of states. Since this is a politics class, I wonder if anybody would like to talk about the Electoral College. You guys understand why we have one in America? Anybody understand what the point is?
Wasn't it originally created because it took too long for people to get the information on their candidates? Like back in the early stages, like 1700s.
Perhaps.
I mean, it's also in effect to make.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Zach. I see what you're saying.
And then it's also because we're a democratic republic, so like we elect officials to represent us anyway. So like there's that as well.
Very good. Yeah. Anybody else want to add to what he said? Why we have an electoral college?
I thought that it was partly also because people just weren't as educated or were led to believe they weren't as educated, and then like elected somebody who was supposedly like going to represent everybody and be of more like sound judgment than the general public.
Yeah. Gabriel, Ches, were you going to say something? But now your mouth is full. Typical.
More representation for little states and big states, so that there would be basically an even playing field if you were like in Middle America versus New York.
Well, that has to do with the number of electoral votes.
Like,
I'm sorry, Gabriel, I cut you off. Can you finish what you were saying?
Oh, like not in the beginning when everything was like on the East Coast, basically, but that was kind of the main idea. Yeah.
Good. Anybody else? Well, to really understand why we have an electoral college, you'd have to look at a document called the Federalist Papers. Some of you were in my class where I taught that a few years ago. Fascinating little book. It was written by, who wrote it? Who wrote the Federalist Papers, y'all?
John Adams?
Nope. I'll give you, there were 3 authors. No? Gosh. The American students here should have studied this in civics class, I thought. I'll give you a hint. One of them has a musical made after him.
Hamilton?
Yeah. Alexander Hamilton. He actually is the biggest author of the Federalist Papers. The other 2 are John Jay and James Madison. There you go. I put them in there. Wow, Gabriel's going nuts here. All right. Well, check them out at your leisure. The Federalist Papers is a book of a selection of papers that were issued to the various newspapers across the country in order to persuade the people to vote for the U.S. Constitution. They were written in 1783. Essentially, they were papers arguing for the way that the Constitution was going to set up our government. And as Zach pointed out, the founders, they understood this to be a republic with some democratic mechanisms to it, but it was not strictly speaking a democracy. In fact, the founders were not big fans of democracy. And so they inserted measures to mitigate or dilute the democracy, right? So so American students, when you're in civics class or history class, you hear about this thing called the balance. What is it? Is it the balance of powers? What is it? How the institutions of the government balance
Checks and
each other out?
balances.
I'm sorry?
The checks and balances.
Checks and balances system, right? The three major bodies in the government: the executive, which is the president; the legislative, which is Congress; and the judicial, which is Supreme Court. Okay, those are the 3. They're supposed to check and balance each other. But the founders were very detailed in how they wanted to understand various kinds of representation. So Congress, they split up into a House of Representatives, which was going to be, people would be elected every other year. And they imagined that this would be the voice of the people. The Senate, those guys would stick around for 6 years. They imagined that these people, these politicians would be, Senate comes from the Latin for senex, for old. They thought these would be the old wise people who would like stick around and be like the voice of wisdom. And then the president is 4 years. Well, the electors, so the Electoral College, believe it or not, yeah, I mean, the point is also that the representatives in the Senate are also going to balance out the more populous states and give representation to the smaller states. So a state like New York will have only 2 senators, but however many representatives. Rhode Island will also have 2 senators, but only 1 representative, right? Well, the Electoral College was also understood to be something that would help the rural populations balance out their power against the more populous states, right? And here is something that I was shocked to discover when I read the Federalist Papers. In the early republic, there was no popular vote for president. Or I should say, yeah, there wasn't. I mean, originally they conceived there was not going to be a popular vote. The president would be chosen by electors, and people, the citizens, would elect the electors. And what would this mean? This means that the citizens would elect people that they believed were wise, because as Zach indicated, like maybe there were various reasons the general population was not plugged in or not paying attention or not sufficiently knowledgeable, but there would be electors who were, and they would make the call and you would trust them. Very early in the Republic, that system was dispensed with. And the electoral system moved to something called winner takes all, which what that means is that in any given state, they follow the popular vote and every single elector votes for the president. It's a crazy system. There's a lot of criticism to it right now. A lot of people argue it needs to be dispensed with.
There's I don't know, hold on. I don't know if like people are aware of this, but there's a really cool like movement right now amongst I think bipartisan governments in states to create a way of without like getting rid of without making a constitutional amendment of getting rid of the electoral college, where they have a binding law that essentially says that if there's enough states that have this same law in place, right, enough to make 270 electoral votes, then this law comes into place that the electors are not assigned to the vote of the state, but to the total popular vote.
Yeah.
So they're right now. I think there's I don't know what states are involved, but I think currently they're at 190. If they just get enough states to get on board, essentially it wouldn't matter what the other electoral states would choose because they'd all allocate them to the popular vote winner. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an interesting philosophical issue here. You can, it's interesting to contemplate and debate the reasoning for why this system was put in place. Essentially, our founders were elitists. As if we didn't know this already. But they were not elitists in the way that we may have suspected. We all knew they were racist, but did you also know they really didn't believe in the working man, right? They didn't really believe in the political aptitude of the working man. They believed that people could be suckered by reality TV stars, for example. And so they believed that there has to be these electors have to be like a firewall. They have to be a group of wise, experienced people who will push back, right, and elect. And what's interesting is that, when they disbanded with the original electoral design in the early 1800s, what you saw going forward is that in any given state where the popular vote went, the electors all lined up to vote for that candidate. 2016 was the first time in a long time where you saw electors opting to follow their individual conscience as Hamilton had intended. And you had, I forget what the term they had for these guys, but they were electors who decided that they
Faithless electors.
Faithless electors, terrible name, but they were going to vote as they saw fit, and they didn't think that the candidate was a good candidate, to win. Should not be president. So very interesting that you saw that happen. But I will say this: so it's an interesting prospect to consider here. In the last 20 years, twice the winning candidate in America has prevailed with a minority of the popular vote, right? In 2000, that was Bush. And then in 2016, it was Trump. And that is troubling, perhaps, for a democracy. What does it mean to be ruled by a minority party, right? On the other hand, from the very beginning of democratic theory, and I'm thinking of like John Mill in particular, wrote in the 1800s, there was a very big concern that democracies, they called this the tyranny of the majority, that democracies that, might steamroll minority votes, or minority voices, I should say. And you need to do what you can to safeguard minority voices. You need to do what you can to make sure that they are heard, right? So we have an interesting choice ahead of us in America, potentially. If we are to get rid of the Electoral College, I mean, that would change politics dramatically. For example, everybody would be gunning for the state of California because they have, I think, the biggest population, right? No one would spend an ounce of time in New Hampshire anymore. I mean, I'm talking about candidates, by the way, right? Think about how campaigning would be so different. We wouldn't have to hear about I don't know what these battleground states would be now. They'd probably be Texas and New York with all the people.
I just posted, actually, I was like doing some other research on another thing that shows a couple maps that break down like the top states for campaigning, and if states were sizes based on the amount of campaign events there. It's whack.
All right. Anybody else have any other comments or questions about the Electoral College? All right. Well, Gabriel's giving you plenty to read up on. Good. So, why don't we talk about Fukuyama? I had you read that book for today. I'm going to start by seeing how you all felt about this book. See anybody any initial reactions? They want to share their initial take on the book or how it read, how it sounded. Anybody want to weigh in? No initial comments? How'd this reading go?
I know I probably say this about like everything we read, but I did enjoy the writing style.
You didn't.
Yeah, it was what are words? It was interesting. I liked that it was kind of pared down a little bit, but there was enough detail from a lot of different sources, I guess you'd say.
So sorry, did you like his writing style, or did you have a problem with his writing style?
No, I liked it.
Oh, good. I think he's okay. I don't think he's too dense. He's not the better writers are coming after him, by the way. When you read Rebecca Solnit, and in particular, she's phenomenal, and Jenny Odell, those are the great writers, and Amitav Ghosh for sure. Anybody else? How this came off to you? No? Okay. Well, I realize I ended up giving you a little bit of a bigger chunk here. I apologize for that. I usually aim around 50 pages. This one was a little bit bigger. But it's a little dense. I hope you found it interesting, at least. Fukuyama is an interesting guy. He is probably the best known American political philosopher right now. I think he's definitely better known than Wendy Brown. Also because Fukuyama has been writing for longer. He's been writing influential stuff for longer, and he's known globally. He's best known for a book that he wrote in the early 1990s called The End of History. And it was a really controversial book at the time because by the way, he used to teach at Hopkins. He's now at Stanford, but he was based at Hopkins campus in Washington for many years. This book, The End of History, really caused a lot of controversy at the time. That's his best known book. And it was written right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the communist nations, many of them transitioned to market economies and democracies, right? That happened within a year. And it was really like a world shattering event. It really was, signaled the defeat of Marxism to many, and it signaled the victory of democracy. And he had the gall in this book, The End of History, to predict that democracy was going to win, and that most, if not all, countries on earth would soon be democracies. And in the early 1990s, that looked like a good bet, except that almost immediately shit went down. And the democracies, many of the countries that had switched to democracies in the mid-90s, they started to revert. or they started to fall apart. I think probably the single most upsetting or disconcerting event of the mid-1990s was the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, right? All these countries had fragmented into democracies, and then you have genocides perpetrated on all sides. And that really was upsetting. And so Fukuyama was pretty soundly railed for that flub, right? That was considered to be a big fuck up and people let him know. But he considers himself an evangelizer of democracy. He's a student of democracy. He has written a couple of, I think, really great books. Another book I used to teach in this class years ago, he talks about why certain countries succeed as democracies and why certain countries do not. And he talks a lot about, for example, about corruption in certain democracies that undermines it, that it undermines them, and how they can, should overcome, or how these countries can overcome corruption. So he's interested in the health and the future of democracies going forward. And this book that he wrote, this was written a few years ago, and it was prompt. This book, like there are others like it. Fukuyama is definitely not right wing. I think he's more of a centrist, if anything. But they're politically speaking. But there are many political thinkers, many of them on the left, who are very critical of identity politics. And they, especially former Marxists, they're very worried about identity politics. Former socialists, they're very worried about it. And a lot of people wrote after Trump's victory in 2016 that was the result of identity politics wreaking havoc on the left and undermining the left. So let me see when exactly he writes this book. This is 2018. So he writes this after the Trump phenomenon. So this is on his radar. I don't know if that's his principal inspiration, but for many it was. Okay. So I'm going to wade in here. Let me pause for Mason. Do you have a question? I see you lit up there.
Oh, no, I'm good.
Cool. Anybody have any questions or comments? So I'm going to wade in here to the text, and then we can open it up for discussion. He opens your reading here talking about, he says that the major change in 21st century politics has been this, that the dominant forces are nationalist and religious parties, as opposed to class-based parties. The 20th century, by contrast, was dominated by class-based parties. That is no longer the case. In fact, in a strange reversal, some of the Democrats and political theorists have been worried about or writing about for the last 20 or 30 years, is that people who were formerly, working class folk and people, related to the labor unions, labor movement, they have been migrating away from the Democratic Party, right? There have been many books written about this. One book in particular, I think it's called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" This was written like 10 or 15 years ago about how middle and lower middle class voters, whose economic concerns are better represented by the Democratic Party, will not vote Democrat, right? Why was this happening? This results in the 21st century that the driving forces in political parties are nationalists and religious parties. And this is not just happening in America, he argues. This is happening globally. And certainly around 2016, 2018, it really looked like nationalism was having a moment. I don't know if that's the case. I'd be curious to hear if you all think that his analysis is still, where it is still pertinent or where it might be lacking, right? But in general, he says there is a global weakness of the left. He is diagnosing a global weakness of the left. And he finds that surprising. Why?
Because you would think that rising inequality that's so abundantly clear, right, would prompt people to collectivize. But it seems, at least in this country, that that the upper leadership in the left is doing everything it can do to stop people from having larger identities than just sort of ethnicity, immigration, right? Like, so I mean to say, like in Bernie Sanders' case, which was, while he espoused, like he was certainly sympathetic to like race identity politics, he never made that a central platform of his, like central part of like his speeches and so forth. It was about the working class. And it's crazy, like news anchors couldn't believe the fact, they couldn't believe like the numbers that were coming out, that actually Trump supporters, like some Trump supporters, would have voted for Bernie Sanders, you know.
Mhm.
um and that's why he had a chance of winning, not because he had a chance of winning everybody on the left. um and so it seems like liberal old like liberal leadership has like attempted to block this,
Mhm.
because it undermines their power in a sense.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders is very much worth considering here and thinking about. Um, but again, I think the broader issue is how prominent is the issue of inequality on people's minds. Fukuyama's point is that it should be the leading, the leading issue. A broader issue that's kind of interesting, that which I have taught in through other texts, is, how is growing inequality felt? How is it registered? There's some thinkers who've written that, it's not the most obvious, it's not the most apparent, concern or issue or problem. It's a kind of problem that makes its self known through kind of hidden, insidious ways, right? But let me just call your attention here. Page 78 is where he lays out, you know, the landscape on inequality, pointing out just how bad it is. He says, according to a study by the International Monetary Fund, in a hollowing out of the middle class, individuals earning from 50 to 100%, 50% of median income fell from 58 to 48% of the population from 2000 to 2014. Only 1/4% did this by moving up into higher income brackets. An astonishing 3.25% moved down the income ladder, right? So I don't know. I mean, that's not an issue he necessarily takes up. He seems to take for granted that growing inequality should be the hot button issue. But what if it's just not perceived? What if it's just not felt? What if it's just not noticed? I'll put a point on it. Do y'all really think that is people's guiding issue?
I mean,
I want to weigh in. Go ahead,
it's,
Gabriel.
oh wait, what, the other Gabriel?
No, you.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, I mean, Fukuyama, I think, he talks about sort of especially in the first question that we had the answer for the discussion, which is sort of about what's called megla. I can't remember what the term was, but essentially, the comparison to others, right, versus the collectivization and individualization, which is something that like we discussed in the very first couple weeks of class. That people, because of that fracturing and because of sort of the narcissistic tendencies that are introduced by all the things that he talks about, it becomes hard to like sort of picture people with vast multitudes of different identities having similar issues to you. The rural farmer, struggling to consistently bring in crop yields, sees himself so far different than somebody working in the inner city, trying to run their liquor store, despite them being in the same income bracket.
Yeah.
It just, because of just the separation, it seems yet they are struggling with the same thing, and they're probably working just equally as hard.
Yeah, it's a good point. I like that. Anybody else?
Which kind of inequality were you referring to?
Are you talking to me? I didn't hear what you said,
Yeah.
Rashad. I'm sorry.
I was asking what kind of equality specifically are you talking about?
Well, we're talking about economic inequality, the growing economic inequality. I mean, here is the broader picture, everybody. The 20th century was a period of where inequality in America was greatly reduced, significantly. In fact, I don't know if this is reflected. This is not reflected in the graph he has there, but there's basically, I think, a giant, the curve looks something like this. Actually, I should do it this way for you all. So here's the 1920s. Inequality is very high. It dips until after the war, inequality in America has a low point, and then it rises again until today. We have the most inequality today that we have had in a century. And what that means is that wealth is concentrated in the rich. The middle class is diminishing in their welfare and well-being and ownership of assets, and the poor, if they're not growing, they have not made significant gains. Strictly speaking, from a Marxist standpoint, that kind of inequality is problematic because you'll have civil war if it gets bad enough, right? But I don't know. I guess I'm questioning. It occurs to me now, his diagnosis is that income inequality, social inequality is being felt or reacted to in different ways. But on its face, I'll be blunt. So what are the measures that would correct social? What are the measures that would correct income inequality? I see Ruben has a comment. I'll look at that in just a second. What are the measures? What are some measures that would correct, social inequality, income inequality?
Can you repeat the question?
Repeat my question. What are the measures? I'll type it. What are some policies? How about that? That would correct inequality. And I mean economic inequality. Y'all can give me at least one off the bat. Come on now.
I don't know if this applies, but what about like bringing manufacturing jobs to America?
Trying to entice manufacturing jobs. Good.
I'd argue that actually increases inequality.
Okay. Well, what about ensuring that we have high-paid jobs? Is that better? Other policies that would help.
Welfare programs.
Yeah, bolster various welfare.
Better funding of public education and free higher education.
Where shall we get the money for this? Did I mention that
A tax
wealth
bracket
is very concentrated? Gabriel Jacobs.
A tax bracket that increases exponentially towards the amount of money that you make, so that it sort of effectively becomes a cap.
Does anybody know what is the highest tax bracket right now? Percent wise. I don't mean money wise. What percent?
Is it 22%?
Nah, you're way low. I'll have to admit, I'm not exactly sure. I think it's 35%. I think that's the highest tax bracket.
You're right. It's at 37.
It was at 38 under Obama. It came down to 35. Did you guys know that in the 1960s, the highest tax bracket was 95%? In America. The socialist states of America. I'm just kidding. That's a fact, though. That was the highest tax bracket. My dates may be off slightly, maybe the 1950s. But I know that when Reagan comes into office in 1980, the tax bracket is 70%. So one thing that, you know, economists have noted is that inequality in America was, thank you, Gabriel, was at its, you know, lowest point when the tax bracket on the rich was extremely high. Okay. So one thing we could do to enact greater equality is to ensure that we have a higher tax bracket. I will also admit I don't actually know what Biden's plan is. I know he wants to tax the rich. Some senators and congressmen have plans to tax what they call the super rich. There are varying plans out there. I'm really not sure what's feasible, but I don't really want to get into a discussion of these issues because I'm going to ask you the question that's really salient to Fukuyama. What's firing people up politically? Is it this stuff or what? Because he thinks it's not. Economics is boring, right?
QAnon, that gets people going.
Well, he might also point to Black Lives Matter. And in that case, you know, his argument is made. It's identity politics that drives people. Now, that's not entirely fair because Black Lives Matter has some serious, as we've been discussing, criminal justice reform issues also included here. But his argument is that most people are not motivated by economic issues, which he thinks that's pretty damn pressing, right? That's the big one here, right? That's the big issue. People tend to get caught up in other issues surrounding recognition. Okay, Ruben, and I realize I forgot to read your comment, so why don't you go for it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What my comment said was that the left is a lot more complacent than the right. And I think it's...
With regard to inequality?
Yes. And I think it's because most of the people that are able to vote in the left, or most of the people that consider themselves left, economically are very privileged. And that's why they don't care, because the same thing that we were talking about last class is that if you don't see it, out of sight, out of mind. Like, the problem is segregation is still a thing. And so half the country is not seeing this inequality we're talking about. Half the country thinks shit is happy-go-lucky. You know, that's the problem, is that the education is not right, and then this country is still segregated to this day.
Well, what's interesting, Ruben, is, you know, on the right, what do you have? That's where at least the white lower middle class is going, and the working class. And what are they supporting? They're supporting tax cuts for the rich. How the hell that happen? Why are they supporting tax cuts for the rich? That's insane. By the way, inequality is going to be worse now, thanks to Trump, because he has cut taxes on the ultra wealthy. So he's made the situation worse. Okay. Gabriel Jacobs says academic exclusionary languages prevents class consciousness. Do you want to expand on that? What do you say? What you mean by that? Explain what you mean.
Yeah, I gotta stop talking because let other people talk. But when like we're all using these really sort of complex terms, like in reading Francis Fukuyama, which is like not even an academic paper, like just like the way that it's talked about, right? It becomes so inaccessible to anybody on the street. Not only do they tune out, but they feel disconnected from you, right? When it's like, described simply, the top 1% of people. Let me show like what does that look like visually? Just like make this amount more than you. Not saying there's a fundamental discrepancy in the way that the tax bracket is laid out. That's like no, like when you give simple language,
Good.
then people can understand. But everybody's so caught up in this academic language and as a way of like justifying themselves in their positions, because if you use simple language, like you're not smart, right? That it becomes a problem.
Good. So Gabriel Jacobs used to just walking around at Walmart and showing people this is what the top income make, maybe something like that. See how that goes down. I'm just messing with you. I don't know. It's a good, I mean, I think it's an excellent question. What would be the way in which this issue could be? How could this issue be presented in a way that people understand and get motivated about it? Because it's not. Right now, they're not. They're just not, unfortunately.
It's not dumbing it down either. You're saying the same things, just yeah.
Well, maybe I should ask this question: what is the evidence? What is the physical evidence of growing inequality? Where do you see it?
Everywhere, but I also live in Baltimore, so it's a little different here.
Mm-hmm. Well, everywhere, America's always had inequality, right? There's always been class divisions, economic divisions. But how would you sense that it's getting worse? Like where is the evidence? Where do you see this getting worse is the issue, right? Actually, I realize I'm kind of skimming over a point here. Ruben is right. I mean, the inequality in this country has always been visible in that the poor, their plight has always been readily seen. Unfortunately, the poor are not the most consequential voice when it comes to politics. So I think we need to move on to approach that issue. But let me pick up where we left off here. So the broader diagnosis is that the rise of global inequality is not just America, right? This is across the board. By the way, he keeps citing this economist named Thomas Piketty, who's a very popular French economist right now. He's written about inequality in a way that really caught people's attention. I'll be teaching him in the spring if anybody's interested in taking that class. And he argues, this rise in global inequality, this should have given rise to a revival of the populist left, which has traditionally argued for using state power to redistribute wealth. But by contrast, we see the emergence of the populist right. And this is across the globe as well. So what do we have? We have growing inequality, and instead of an economic response, we have populism. On the right, we have nationalism. Nationalism has been the response to global inequality, okay? He argues that economists tend to think people are motivated by material desires and interests. And, economists, this is a common complaint against them. They tend to think of people as rational actors. And that's a big mistake. Consumers are never rational. People are not rational. By contrast, he tells us that many, if not most people, are in fact driven by what he calls a thematic desire for recognition. They want respect. That's what people want. This gives rise to his interesting discussion about poverty in America. And how it compares globally. Our poor are not utterly destitute, as he argues, and not quite as destitute as third world nations. But, poverty is always a matter of degrees, is always a relative issue, of course. But he says the principal complaint or plight of being poor in our wealthy society is that the pain of poverty is felt more often as a loss of dignity. This is on page 84. The pain of poverty is more often felt as a loss of dignity.
I have a question about that section. He starts by comparing it to how he compares it to the pay gap between men and women.
Yeah.
And on 82, he's saying that like women in position of power but are still like paid less than men, like it's only a moral issue and it's not an economic issue. But I don't agree with that. Like if someone is getting paid less because of who they are, like yeah, it is a moral issue, but they're actually like receiving less, and like then in turn like their family doesn't get as much, and like generationally it's not passed down. And then like in this circumstance, like then women are still earning less and are more dependent on men, and it just fuels patriarchy. And he's saying that this sort of problem of people getting paid less than someone else is not an economic problem, but more of a dignity issue.
Can I respond to that?
You want me to respond to it?
Or can I respond to it?
Yeah.
If I read it right, the way that I read it was economic issue, as in like this pay gap isn't causing them to like starve, and like in these high-paying jobs, they're already being paid a lot of money, and the number that he used was like even if they are being paid 10% less, and so it wasn't an issue of like will they be able to pay rent this month or something like that, but it was that this decrease in the money that they're being paid, even though everything is the same on paper, it shows that like they're being measured, like money is a measure of their dignity. And so I don't think that, or from what I read, I recall him saying that it wasn't a moral one, but an issue about justice, where it's unjust for like somebody to value you less for your gender, even if everything is the same on paper. And that's just how I read it. But
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but like, you're right. Like, it's not an issue of like they're not gonna make rent this month, but you're right. It's not a short-term issue, but it is a long-term issue.
Well, first of all, he's not saying women should be paid less. His argument is at the top of 82. He says, among this group, what is the real motive driving demands for equal pay? It is not economic. Because if it were, they would ensure that women across the board are paid more. They want to see women in higher positions of power, even if they're paid less. So he's arguing that the central driver is dignity. It's not actually economics. But it should be. Both, at least. Mason?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think also you can see the shift from economic to more dignity concerns, just like in the rhetoric of popular feminism. The pay gap like is important to close, but it's become less and less of a talking point as it has narrowed over time. I think now a lot of like feminist concerns are more about interracial feminism, where there is still like larger gaps between like white women and women of color. And just, yeah, again, like the dignity issues all around. That's why we care about like quote unquote like strong female characters and stuff like that. That's become popular talking points.
Rashad, what do you mean?
Oh, what was you saying? Sorry.
You said, isn't there an earnings gap, not a wage gap? Can you explain what you mean?
Like, I could be wrong, but the way I understand it is that a wage gap would be like you, like we have the same amount of experience, the same education, we come in at the same level, but we like our actual like hour or salary is different as opposed to getting paid the same per hour and you work more or just a different job. You know what I'm saying? I could be wrong, but that was my
I'm not really sure. I think it's both, frankly. I'm not really sure.
So like I guess I could give an example. Like a wage gap would be like if me and someone both work at a place and we make I don't know like
Oh,
15.
oh, you mean like higher up? We're talking
Huh?
higher up. Yes, Rashad, I think I get you now. Sorry, I cut you off there, Mason. I thought I appreciate your point. You seem to be paying attention to popular feminist authors, so that's good to hear your perspective on this. I'm not a scholar in that for sure, but I think you get his critique right. The point is that in this country, at least, poverty, is measured or the point is that recognition and disrespect. Salary is understood as a measure of disrespect. Salaries, or I should say your position, maybe not your salary, but your position, right? And so this makes it easier to give people certain positions, but not the kind of salary that might, be accordingly risen to that height as well, right? It's a way to avoid that issue. Or to be very blunt, politically speaking, as he's going to point out, you can satisfy people's desire for recognition and ignore the economic issues completely. And his diagnosis the is that it is right now, contemporary feminists are too caught up with they're sidetracked by the concern for recognition as opposed to this very real earnings gap. And the earnings gap, Rashad is right, like it's not the wage gap, it's the earnings gap, because women, as they rise through the professional ranks, they will tend to have lower salaries than men at the same age. And there are a variety of factors that go into that, right? Especially if women have children, if they have to take time off for pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera. So how does that sound? Is that okay, everybody? Am I missing anything? Yeah. Okay. So this leads to the big issue that, and so he again, this leads to an interesting point. He says on 84, this is why he calls it, well, in the business, we call it UBI, Universal Basic Income. This is getting some kind of currency now. Y'all, what was his name? Yang? Sorry, I misspelled. Yang, was he the politician who was big on that? There are a lot of people into that. This universal, I'm going to be teaching about this again in my capitalism class in the spring if you're interested. But, universal basic income is a big, big concern. Chalmin, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang, yep.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, it's really, I am worried about this UBI, but it's a really pertinent topic because, listen, the machines are coming for your jobs, everybody, right? Automation is a big concern. It is expanding into more and more fields, not just manufacturing. It's expanding into legal fields, and it's the risking to make the jobs of many people redundant, right? In 10 years, there will be robot artists and you'll be put out of work. I'm just joking, see if anybody was paying attention.
I like that. I like the idea of robot artists, though. I want to see what they have to make.
Hey, bro, chill out.
Rashad, what? Did I upset you? Sorry. No, but I mean, automation is a really big concern. So what are we going to do? Andrew Yang, following ideas from various Silicon Valley folk is just, let's just make sure people have a guaranteed income. I tend to think that this would be disastrous. His reasoning is work is about dignity. It's not about money. And if you put people on the dole effectively, which is what you would be doing with universal basic income, this is going to, you'll have a backlash. This is not going to go well. This will not solve the problems. But regarding the poor, he says, he goes on to say that, and this is a point I was trying to address to Ruben earlier, inequality surrounding the poor has been well known in America and long been ignored. And Fukuyama says, listen, the poor, historically speaking, have not been the most active vocal voice on the vocal group on economic issues. It's the middle class. They're the ones who tend to speak up. And he quotes Tocqueville, who wrote that the middle class, the bourgeoisie, actually, they were the drivers behind the French Revolution. And why is that the case? Because they had the means, they had the resources, they had education, they had political connections already. The poor are always at a political disadvantage. The only thing they have are the numbers. But the middle class, they're often well disposed to act out and react politically. This is on page 85, 86. He brings up this issue where he has quoted de Tocqueville. And he says at the bottom of 85, more importantly, but the middle class, they feel their economic status entitles them to respect. They work hard at jobs that are useful to society. They raise families and they carry out their responsibilities to society, such as paying taxes. They know they are not at the top of the economic heap, but they also have pride in not being indigent or dependent on government help to survive. Middle class people do not feel themselves to be at the margin of society. Rather, they typically feel they constitute the core of national identity. So God forbid they feel disrespected. Because here's one thing that middle class people do. They vote. They vote. So his diagnosis is that we have reached a situation in this country where the middle class feels disrespected. And this is what he argues is the most important driver for Trump voters. In 88, he talks about the perception of invisibility. Trump voters felt invisible. It wasn't principally about economic issues, even though they weren't doing well. They complained in other ways. Page 88, he brings this up. He says, middle of the page, resentful citizens fearing loss of middle-class status point an accusatory finger upward to the elites, to whom they are invisible, but also downward towards the poor, whom they feel are undeserving and being unfairly favored. According to Kramer, resentment towards fellow citizens is front and center. People understand their circumstances as the fault of guilty and less deserving people, not as a product of broad social, economic, and political forces. So why are we losing our manufacturing jobs? Immigrants, right? Not globalization. But in truth, it was globalization. And in truth, it was not immigrants. But that was the way they felt they would diagnose this problem, right? And complain. Comments or questions? Anybody agree or anybody disagree with his diagnosis so far? You want to speak up? So in his view, he's not terribly surprised why, this is his explanation for why right-wing populism has won out. Because, well, people will easily ignore economic issues, or there's another reason. well, we'll get into that in a second about these economic issues. They will tend to ignore them, and they tend to be captivated by other issues, especially if they're middle class. They're not like they're not dying. You know, I mean, the Trump voters, they lost their manufacturing jobs and they got jobs at Walmart. It's not exactly poverty, but it's close. Right. And they will principally, and their complaint amounted to not economic complaints, but complaints about immigrants, complaints about being disrespected by the elites. What was that thing that Hillary said that upset them? The
Deplorables.
Thank you. I saw a bumper sticker the other day saying the deplorables, get ready for another deplorable revolution in 2020, something like that, right? They're deplorables. And so again, their issue was they are disrespected. And they will.
I'd argue, although it seems silly, that like if like it because it's such a like it's a 4-syllable word that like you really almost never hear outside of, you know, like higher institution like that's why it stuck. That's why it got so, you know, as opposed to basket cases or, you know.
What is she called? Deplorable.
Who did she call?
Trump.
Yeah, who did oh.
Well, see, she was referring to the term was really stupid. It was a basket of deplorables. But she was referring to a section or segment of Trump voters that were known neo-Nazis and racists. Like I think it was a conversation about David Duke, the head of the Ku Klux Klan, who had endorsed Trump recently. At that point,
people were upset
there's a
that she called
basket
them
of deplorables supporting him. Sorry,
Like
Rashad?
people got upset because she called white supremacists deplorables.
Well, what was interesting is that I don't know who's responsible for it, but somebody made the Trump voters to understand as a whole that this was about them.
That's crazy how narratives get twisted so much.
I mean, I remember right after she said the words on the Sunday talk shows, like I think Kane, her VP, was on there saying, you know, trying to defend her. And he was saying, she was referring to KKK people. It's perfectly understandable why do you not agree they're deplorable? But someone in the Trump campaign was able to switch it around and make it so that all the Trump people felt that they were being called deplorable by these fucking elites, these coastal elites, right? They're up to it again. Look at that quote right above it on page 88 in the middle of the page. He says, similarly, a Tea Party voter in rural Louisiana commented, a lot of liberal commentators look down on people like me, okay? We can't say the N-word. We wouldn't want to. That's a lie. It's demeaning. So why do liberal commentators feel free to use the R word, redneck? So redneck, deplorables, interchangeable, right? There you go.
Yeah, that explains how Trump turned it against her.
And you got to give him credit. He did it. He pulled it off. He completely transformed those words, and now they wear it as a badge of pride. We are deplorables. Right. Good. Anybody else? Any other questions or issues or whatever?
I hadn't heard about the whole deplorables thing until just now, and it's so ridiculous. Like the solidarity that like Trump supporters continue to have for like white supremacists, like it doesn't surprise me anymore, but it is just stupid and horrifying every time I hear it.
Yep.
Like it's just so ridiculous. It was just like a little bit more of like, I guess you'd say political literacy. I'm like, guys, come on.
But I hear you, Mason. But we have to reckon with the fact that this really appealed to them, right? Why did this resonate? This resonated with them. So, and this is now their rallying cry, you know? It was a very big PR win, I agree. Anybody else want to complain or lament? Let's talk about identity politics, okay? That's really what this book is about. I'm going to skip that to page 115. I want to get into his critique. But before we dive into the critique, I wonder if anybody would like to define what identity politics is, just so we're clear. I mean, we've kind of been building up to it. A lot of it's implied what we're discussing here, but anybody want to help us define it properly?
Wouldn't it be just whatever group and their ideology that's like what you align with? Isn't that what it would be?
Good. Can anybody add any specifics to Rashad's point? Hello, hello. Any examples? All right. You're going to make me work. Damn it. I hate working. All right. Yeah, I mean, I would only add to what Rashad said is that people would tend to identify with a specific cultural group or racial group. I mean, gosh, it could be gender, sexual preference. I mean, gay rights, women's rights, minority rights, right? This is the stuff that wins out. And this is the stuff that, his general claim is that these are the issues that really captivate and mobilize voters. Not only on the left, haha, but on the right, haha, right? So before we dive into the latter part, let's talk about his critique of identity politics. What are his criticisms of the dominance of identity politics? Are you guys able to hear that guitar behind me? It's my daughter. Sorry. Anyway, back to business. Identity politics. What are some of his criticisms of identity politics? All right. Guys are a little bit slower today than usual, a little bit quiet. I'm gonna ask a dangerous question to get us started here. Who does identity politics threaten how does identity politics threaten free speech? Boom, you're welcome. I just dropped a bomb right in your midst.
Well, the central argument, at least from what my understanding is that generally speaking, people will believe that if, for instance, you say that a word is like triggering or controversial and that no one can ever say it anymore, that in turn is making infringing on people's freedom to actually say said word regardless of its meaning or intention behind it in the context of the use.
Great, Zach. That's very good. Anybody else? Yeah, he says at the top of 117, he says, notes one observer, our political culture is marked at the micro level by the fusion of a given person's opinion and what they perceive to be their singular, permanent, authentic self. This privileges opinions sincerely held over reasoned deliberation that may force one to abandon those opinions. That an argument is offensive to someone's sense of worth, self-worth, is often seen as sufficient to delegitimize it. A trend encouraged by the kind of short-term discourse propagated by social media. What's he saying about social media here? Anybody want to translate?
Is he talking about like cancel culture and that kind of stuff?
Well, he's not, because he didn't know it.
Yeah.
Cancel
Okay.
culture is more recent, but
No,
I
I
think
know, but
that's
like,
the
is
depth of
that's what
further.
he's alluding to, like that kind of mindset, correct? Or
I guess so. I mean, what role does social media play? Does social media play a critical role in this?
well, I guess, for lack of better words, it makes the process quicker
Mm.
than what normally would be achievable, I guess.
Yeah.
Like normally, like this would take well, okay, I mean, obviously there's a lot of issues and then people will like rally behind it, but like because of the fact that you can just at the click of a button make everyone aware of something, like you could just tweet out something like everyone has access to everything now in a sense, especially with things like Twitter. Like if you want to like just say like I just took a shit, you know, like now everyone knows. So like if you put it on Twitter, so it's like you know, like you can say your piece, you can say your 2 cents about an issue, and now everyone knows that. And then like now everyone can either rally behind you or immediately say to you, no, you're wrong, I don't think you deserve to have a right anymore, and you should be off the platform entirely, and you should lose everything. Now obviously, like, you know, some people will like say things that are especially heinous, and like it's right to like I guess like like bring down the torches, I guess, in some cases, but like doing that doesn't necessarily help the situation either, because you like if like I come across this problem in like whenever I play video games a lot, where it's like you'll have a person that is doing terribly, and if someone just tells them like, hey shithead, you're a piece of trash, log off, you know, like that's not going to make the person like change their views. They're not going to be like, oh, you know what, you're right, you know, you just called me a shithead, but that means no sense to me anymore. Like, let's just like totally turn myself around. Like, you should have the conversation with the person and explain why they're wrong, but not in a demeaning way, and like try and help them through it. And that will usually garner better results than just simply telling them that they're an idiot, because that just makes things worse. And then like everything gets more hectic.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like, especially to the point of like if you like say you're having a conversation with someone or like thereof, and
Hey, Rashad, can you do me a favor and speak like right to your microphone? We're losing some
oh yeah,
words.
yeah, I got you. I'm like on my phone. What he was just saying about like if like we're talking about like, identity politics, like if you are like identify or align with something that that person doesn't necessarily agree with, or like they'll like put you in a box, and like anything you say becomes like invalid, and they won't listen to it, or they'll hear it and it'll like just piss them off because they're like associating you with something else. And that's the dangerous thing about like uh putting yourself in a category, is that like you don't necessarily agree with every single thing that other people in that group think. Like there's extreme ends and then there's ends where people are as extreme, but you wouldn't know where that person lies until you have a conversation. And I feel like some people just don't want to have the conversation at all. Like they just get right to emotion and just cut it off before it gets anywhere productive.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, Rashad, you're still a little bit hard to hear, but I pretty much got what you said there. I hope other people able to hear. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned emotion. There's something about social media that really, you know, makes people's emotions rise, like anger in particular, right? I have a tip for everybody. I'm relatively old and wise compared to you all. If you're angry, don't go on social media. Just don't do it. Chances are very low that you'll say something that's productive. Anger is an irrational emotion. And social media is, not a great platform for conveying. I should say it's the kind of platform that easily makes people angry, right? Twitter is a great example. You can't give context with a tweet. Twitter was like designed to make people angry, because when you don't have context, that's when you get pissed off. But you can't give context on Twitter, right? And so much social media and digital media, for that matter, I'm thinking of texting too, just the way it's used, it's used in a way that bypasses context. So yeah, I mean, I think it is dangerous, it definitely, I think it makes things rough. It makes things hard, it makes it more fraught. That's the word. And by fraught, I mean like more tense. Social media takes anger and makes it worse and makes more people angry. It doesn't make us all more reasonable. I have yet to see that. Anybody else?
The, can you hear me fine?
I can.
Okay. The term identity politics and social media too is just so spicy. It is really spicy. I feel, and the definition of it varies too, like with different people. So it's just very frustrating as a concept to wrap my head around. That's why I've kind of stayed a little quiet during this time. But I feel both sides, whether or not both sides are using it, it's a very weird, if you're using it in an argument context, it's a very weird way to get through with an argument. Like on like a left, maybe some people would be like, shut up, you're white. But then another person would be like, looking at someone like Candace Owens, someone who is very staunchly conservative, but she's also Black. So they like kind of tokenize her as, look, we have a Black person on her side. Like, and I believe both things are very, very weird ways of framing an argument that's not really based on evidence or what we're talking at hand. So
you are totally right, Gabriel. It is very spicy. It's very tense. It really is. I could take this discussion in a highly personal direction, which I will presently. I'm just waiting for the right moment. And by personal, I don't mean implicating me. I mean, I'm going to implicate all of us at MICA very intimately. But I want to make sure we grasp his full argument before we get into this, first of all. So let me keep going. So identity politics, and so identity politics, it threatens free speech, he argues. There's a lot more to say about that, a lot more. His main argument is, it's kind of implied, but the real business of politics right now should be directed at economic inequality. A lot would be gained. A lot of the problems would be solved if we could tackle that. But instead, politicians and voters tend to focus on identity issues. Why is this? Well, on page 115, he says, because it's easy to throw voters a bone with identity issues, right? You can solve that, but clawing back money from the ultra rich and expanding welfare programs and giving everybody free college education, those are much harder nuts to crack. That's a much tougher order. It's so much easier just to give in to people's desire for respect and recognition. Okay. He also says that identity politics makes for greater polarization. Makes for greater political polarization. And we are in a very polarized environment right now in America. Why does he think that identity politics gives rise to greater polarization?
It separates people into categories. And that's like
it separates people into categories. What else? There's something about the understanding of and creation of these identities. Historically, he says, that makes it difficult to bridge the divides. What's that all about?
Can you repeat that?
He points out that there's something about the history of identity and how it was developed, how it was understood and articulated, that makes it very difficult to bridge the divides. Didn't help. I'm thinking in particular, he talks about feminism again, and Simone de Beauvoir in particular, and this issue of lived experience that is at the heart of identity politics. I have unique lived experience. You need to respect what I am going through, what I am suffering, what are my formative, influences and whatnot. And they're fundamentally different from yours. Why does this make for polarization, everybody?
Because I guess everyone would technically have their own experience with certain things, so everybody will only be able to relate to themselves.
It's you nailed it, Rashad. It's an issue of relatability.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to relate if we're all in different camps with unique lived experiences that have made us so different, right? You can't possibly understand what I'm going through. You can't possibly understand what I need. And this is going to make for a greater difference across the board. Good. Okay. Now we need to approach the big, I think, which is the big issue here. I'm going to return to the issue of speech. Okay. The big issue is this, everybody. The big issue is, identity politics. He argues to the left, listen, identity politics is problematic. You have been rallying around identity politics as opposed to economic concerns, and this has not served you well because it takes the focus off the main issue. It threatens free speech, and it polarizes people, quite frankly, right? Compromise is important in democracy. And then he says it has also emboldened the right. And nobody in the left saw that coming. All right. That's the big issue here. But this again has to do, this is again, in his view, partly, if not principally related to issues of speech again. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to briefly revisit the discussion. Well, actually, I'm going to put that on the back burner for a second. I was going to revisit the discussion of speech, but I'm going to bypass that for the moment. And I'm going to just ask the question about the right wing. Why did, actually I have it here. What is it with this right wing identity politics? Why did it rise? Why do we have, well, maybe I should ask that question first. What the hell is right wing identity politics? Maybe somebody wants to tell me what that is first. What is right wing identity politics and why the right wing adopt it? Go ahead.
I feel like when right wingers try to do identity politics, like it's in response to left identity politics. So they'll try to subvert whatever is happening there. So to give an example, there's this prominent conservative that was more famous years ago called Milo Yiannopoulos.
Oh yeah.
And he
I met him.
Yeah. He's very conservative, but it's subversive because he's gay. So a conservative will be like, I don't really trust this gay person, but whoa, he has all the same political opinions as me. So he ain't so bad. That is that's the whole thing. And also you see this again with the person I mentioned, Candace Owens, and all these people that it is very strange. I would say it's a subversion.
Good.
I think the sort of collectivization of the white identity, and then sort of positing that it's being erased, So, you know, I think because sort of where there's initial immigrant groups that were, you know, quite different, you know, Italians and Irish and so forth, have sort of culturally merged, right? Has created sort of a very loose, disparate idea of what it is to be Caucasian in this country. And, you know, rather than sort of appreciating sort of that identity as being, you know, amalgamation of, you know, sort of sort of all European ideals, there's
Yeah.
this yearning to come up with a new identity that doesn't exist in the first place, right?
What is it?
That's the question, right? Is that all these people talk about like losing the white identity and like, you know,
He
and
calls it white nationalism,
what,
right? He just
right,
uses
white
that term.
nationalism.
You have varying.
But the thing is, it's undefined because it's really just more, you know, more sort of a fear of the other, right? Of the displacement of not, you know,
Well, we can debate that in a second, Gabriel. Let me just make sure that everybody understands the moral of the story here. Okay, you need to understand his argument, and the main argument is that that the left wing, you know, entertained and encouraged identity politics for decades and decades, and got deeper in, and then all of a sudden it bit them in the ass, and it bit them in the ass because the right wing adopted it, and they arguably adopted it better. They got people out to the polls. They got people energized and rallied and mobilized and unified. And you know, I don't disagree with what you said, Gabriel Jacobs, that you know it's ill-defined, but it's a thing, right? It's a thing. People, you hear, the more important thing is you hear the language of victimization from working class whites who line up for Trump, really, right? It is, you know, there's reverse racism now. They're coming after us. They looked at that we're deplorables. They're looking down on us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? This is not something the liberals anticipated, he argues.
Isn't that like exactly how you can manipulate someone if you convince them or if they believe that they're the ones that are they're the ones that are being punched down at, like if they're like not being treated right, if
Sure.
they're isn't that how you manipulate them?
It's manipulation, you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think it is. But it's worked, right? It's worked. Look at the top of page 122. He says, what is notable, however, is how the right has adopted the language and framing of identity from the left. That's the point. The idea that my particular group is being victimized, that its situation and sufferings are invisible to the rest of society, and the whole of the social and political structure responsible for the situation needs to be smashed, right? We are being oppressed. We are oppressed by an elite who thinks we are invisible. And yet, you know, we are a core identity group of this nation. Blah, 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 blah. You can complain all you want. They've taken it over. They borrowed the identity politics and they made a big deal about it, right? And they mobilized voters in that direction.
I mean, I think I think it is like important to feel sort of part of a group, right? Especially like as humans and sort of a shared history. Um, and so, you know, we also see there's like this reclamation in a lot of these white nationalist groups being like, you know, I come from proud Italian stock, right? Or like, you know, you know, Franco-Irish, as if like they have sort of any ties back to that at all. So this desperate sort of clinging on to trying to find some sort of identity rather than like reckoning with the hard fact that you are a product of the melting pot of all the white people from Europe. And so your identity should be as Americans, not as white Americans. But, you know, it doesn't stop people from feeling, you know, from seeing, you know, people from other diasporas have sort of proud traditions and so forth, and them feeling sort of left out.
Mm-hmm. Good. Gia.
I agree with that in some ways, but also not. Mostly just because like I am an Italian American, and like I have a direct bloodline, and I'm working on getting my citizenship, and I do have my ties. But I also recognize, like, of course, I'm part of the melting pot, but I do know like my heritage, and many other people do, and like can trace it back. So I wouldn't like generalize that heavily. Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
it's
I just would
difficult. In
generalize.
America, it's messy, right? I think Gabriel is right. In America, it's very messy. It's much more difficult in Europe because, like, you have Germans who will say, "We're the original Germans." Okay, we're the original Belgians. We're the original Irish or English. Um, they're having a very lively debate in France about this.
What does that even mean?
Huh?
What does that even mean? Like they were the first people to settle there? Like,
That
what does
this
that
is
mean?
country like, yeah, I mean, it's about an ethnic and linguistic and cultural identity, right? Um, and we preceded those immigrants who came here. I think, Gabriel, your comments about America are totally right. Like the idea of a white nationalist is a complete hodgepodge. It's like totally inchoate and incoherent. Because of our immigrant past, recent immigrant past, at least for white people. If you go to Europe, though, I mean, it's harder because you have these white identities that have been living there in the same place for a period of time. The reason France is a little bit complicated, I was going to say, is because it turns out that a quarter of the so a quarter of all white French people have a grandparent from outside France. France is also really quite an immigrant country too. So they're kind of grappling with this. But you're right, like, Gabriel, the issue is, what does it mean to rally around the fact that you're just white? What does that mean? Like, big deal, right? But I think in America, what this white nationalists, what they're really rallying about is that they are rural voters, right? Sarah Palin said it. Remember Sarah Palin, that shithead? She went out and she said, I'm speaking to the real Americans. Oh, fuck you, She go out to rural America. I'm speaking to the real Americans. I pay my taxes, screw you. But there are people in this country who feel that they are the real Americans. They're the white people, working class, live in these small towns, right? And they feel they have an identity that's being ignored and dissed, and they're going to rally around it.
Bro, that's hilarious, bro. That's
And they,
I
but
do want
most
to
like
importantly,
evil
hang on,
genius.
Gabriel, where Fukuyama is most consistent is the point that they have borrowed the language of victimization from identity politics. Just keep your eye on that.
Bro, that's oh my god. That
All right,
sounds like
Gabriel
an evil
Jacobs, go
plan.
for it. You were about to say something.
all I wanted to say is going back to what Gia was saying, and saying that that's totally legitimate. And, especially when you mentioned that you have like a little Italian citizenship. I think I'm more talking about like most Americans, when they say they have this sort of heritage, are multi-generation removed, way beyond removed. They don't know a word of German or French, but they want to establish pride, and they see it as an sort of an ethnic pride, right? I think that like your Italian heritage is not necessarily because you're ethnically Italian, but because your parents come from Italy, and there's a set of values that are location based, right? So like, ideally, you'd want like these white nationalists should realize that no, your values come from the location of being in America. What are American values? But they're looking, because there is no ethnic American, but they try to reach back this like ridiculous chain, to find themselves.
I like the way you put it right there, Gabriel. Is there an ethnic American? That's a crazy idea. I mean, I think that's a good difference. That's where the Europeans will point out, oh, I'm an ethnic German. Oh, I'm an ethnic Norwegian. I call bullshit on that too. That's a harder nut to crack. But let's see, Gia, you had your hand up, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I did want to point out, like, I know that you're, like, I guess acknowledging the difference between that. Like, I don't associate myself with white nationalists, and I know that like that
Of
language
course not.
used as like, oh, what about us? So I don't mean that. I would just suggest, like, I don't know. I feel like, especially since coming to Micah, like other people's language and how like this can be talked about has like steered me personally, like, and subconsciously away from talking about my heritage and work, almost like feeling like I'm not allowed to and things like that. So I'm kind of like rediscovering my own history and how that works. So yeah, just like making that point that like,
Well, I think what I would say is, again, I would emphasize that, you know, the main point he wishes to make is that this white nationalism, they have borrowed the language of victimization. And right, you know, half the white population in America, and probably less, has bought this, has signed on to this program of white nationalism. I mean, most white voters have not, right? That's not their principal identity. They wouldn't say it's that I'm white, right? Sarah.
I was pretty much just going to bring up like an iteration of what Mason said in the chat. I think like going off of what Gabriel brought up, I think like I have more sympathy for like white people who don't really have a like understanding, and they want to find like some sort of like, I don't know. I also, maybe because like my family is also immigrants, and I relate like wanting to find that sort of ancestral like connection towards some sort of culture. But like I think the conversation is more like what was mentioned is like whiteness as a culture. Like, and that's like kind of bringing up like taking that like victimization language. Like that's the issue, is that like white people don't have like a culture as white people, and
That's
like
right.
they don't and they shouldn't be celebrating like some white culture or
Right.
whatever, as opposed to, I literally saw like a TikTok, LOL, that like explained it quite clearly. I think someone from Micah posted it as saying like Black people, their culture was stolen from them, stripped from them. Like these people were literally taken from their homes, from their cultures, and brought to America, and their ancestors are completely displaced from those sorts of things, as opposed to white people. Like if you have like distant ancestors who were Italian and you have like interest in that, great. But that's not being white. That's kind of trying to find like just different cultures, if that makes sense.
Well, I see what Mason's saying here in the chat. Most people are like, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I don't hear Gia saying she's not white. I'm Irish. I will never admit,
I'm very
I've never admit I'm not white. I'm white. I mean, you know, I'm not going to run away from it. But yeah, I like what I'm hearing. I think you guys raised some good points. Like, yeah, this idea of white nationalism is incoherent. Yeah, sure, but you know, it's something that some people have found some excuse to rally around, right? You have, you know, he doesn't really talk about it, but like white Christians, there's a lot of Christians who are using the language of victimization now too, right? And his message is this. We'll get more into this next week, but he thinks this playbook of identity politics is ill-conceived completely, for the reasons he's mentioned, because it polarizes, it undermines free speech, it fragments people, it takes our eye off the ball of what the main issue is, but also because it secretly empowered the right. It secretly mobilized them and motivated them, right? And you can call it incoherent, you can say whatever you want, but it's done its dirty work. And he thinks that the best way to diffuse populism on the right is to diffuse identity politics. We need to take a step back. Did you notice, and I think that's pretty much all I want to say about that point. So I see we're rapidly approaching a time where we probably should end, but I'll leave it open for a second, see if anybody has any comments or questions. Anybody have anything you want to talk about, or any questions, observations, complaints?
I think is a way to like uphold culture. Like there's absolutely a way to uphold culture without resorting to ethnicity or race. I say that being somebody who's Jewish, I think that like most, most Jews recognize that there is actually no ethnic Jew. And there's nobody, there might be sort of shared traits, but I mean, I'm under no impression that Moses was, Moses looked like me at all. He was very likely Middle Eastern. And slowly those people sort of, mix with people who are Polish and who are Hungarian. But I recognize my Judaism as something that's important to me because it was passed down, not because my blood is a certain type. And it's passed down, and those values and learning those things. And to be Jewish, like anybody can convert, but it's much harder to convert because you have to dedicate like a couple of years of your life to learning all the Talmudic stuff, to get so there's like a high bar, right? Yeah, because
Good.
there are a lot of African Black Jews that people don't know about. Not the same as Black Israelites, because that's sort of a different thing. But I think there's a way to to have a cultural identity and have it be separate from race.
You can do that, but certain areas have a certain culture. Like if you're from a certain area, that area has a different has a certain culture, and people tend to like if there are a group of people that's from that area, those group of people are typically gonna.
Oh, I lost you, Rashad.
You froze.
Froze up. Well, while he's unfreezing, let me just say this. I mean, the real issue is that these smaller identities are really what rally people, like it or not. Let me just speak from the European perspective for a second. What's going on in Europe, right? European nations are secularizing, right? Which means they're really not Christian anymore. So what do people have to rally around? They tend to, if you're not rallying around your religion, they rally around their soccer teams. Mason, you're so funny. They rally, just a second. They rally around, she read the ending by accident. They rally, people rally around their nationality, right? They rally around their nationality. Like in France, it's really remarkable how they identify with this thing called being French. What the hell does it mean to be French? It turns out being French is a really recent phenomenon, right? It as recently as the late 1800s, most people in France did not speak French. Just imagine. It's a melting pot nation, just as every nation is, right? So if any Germans who want to go off and say that they're proud of their identity, their ethnic identity, I'm going to point out to them, you go back a couple generations and their blood is mixed. They have Nordic influence, Eastern, Slavic. My family is from Ireland. Do you know what it means to be Irish? It means to be a mutt. You have the Vikings, you have the Anglo-Saxons, you have the Celts. You go far back enough, that's what you find everywhere, right? So this idea of an ethnic identity is a myth, but it is a very potent rallying cry. The bigger philosophical issue is, why do people need these rallying cries? Why do people want to rally around these smaller identity groups, right? All right, Mason, what are you going to say?
Oh yeah, if I can spoil, so I initially read the wrong chapters of Fukuyama, but for next week's reading, Gabriel, what you're talking about kind of reminds me of a concept that Fukuyama introduces about like the creedal nation, where it's like rallying around like a shared values and beliefs instead of like a religious or ethnic identity.
Yeah, you read my mind, Mason. I was going to end today by just pointing ahead and saying that his argument is going to be that instead of gravitating to and rallying around smaller identities, which tend to polarize us and divide us, we need to start to rally around larger identities. We need to and in the United States, that would be a creedal identity. A creed is a belief. And he's not talking about religion. He's talking about a commitment to certain democratic and political values. But that's all I'll say about that. I'll leave that for you all for next week, because we're out of time here. I got to let you all go. But anybody have anything they want to say before we break? I think we have a very spicy discussion in store because Zach got us going somewhere that I think we need to go. And it's not going to be comfortable, everybody. I'm warning you. But I do think we need to talk about cancel culture because he's talking about political correctness. He is so cute. He is trapped in the nostalgia of 2015. Political correctness is an older ancestor of cancel culture, which he does not anticipate. It's amazing. He wrote this book in 2018 and cancel culture is now a thing. Some have described it as a more potent form of political correctness. But I think you could argue that cancel culture absolutely exemplifies the dangers he's worried about. And cancel culture has come to Micah in a big way. So I think we got to talk about it, everybody. I hope I don't get fired in the process. Can you all be sure you won't get me fired? I'll try to be careful. I know. I hope it's not me, Mason. Anyway. All right, everybody. I got to let you go, okay? Have yourself a wonderful week. And you all know what you need to do for next week. You're going to read chapters 13 and 14. Although, Mason, now you got to read what we read for today. And I'll see you all, okay?
Thank
Take
you. Have a
care.
good weekend.
If
Yeah,
you haven't
thank you.
voted, get on that. Bye.